On July 20th, 2013, I got the opportunity to partake in a very meaningful experience in my life. On that day, I got married. And we got married in Cancun, Mexico, on the rooftop of a hotel overlooking the Caribbean Sea. Yes, be jealous. It was so beautiful and absolute paradise. The only thing I would have changed, though, was that there was 95% humidity, and for a person getting married and having makeup and hair done, that is not good. So other than that, it was perfect. And before we got married, we were told by a few of our friends who had been doing this marriage thing for a while that our first year of marriage, we were going to either experience, one, blissful paradise and everything would go really smooth, or two, things would be really, really, really difficult. In our first year of marriage, we experienced absolute bliss. It was wonderful. I began to think, oh my goodness, we really have this marriage thing down. I don't know what people are so caught up in. It's not really that hard. And you know what happens. The moment you get confident and you get cocky, something takes a turn. So our first year anniversary comes around, and suddenly this big dark cloud comes over our life, and we're just like, what just happened? We are no longer in paradise. And we began to argue, and I apologize to Nick and Patricia because they are our next door neighbors, so they probably had to endure listening through a lot of our arguments, and I apologize. But during these arguments that we would have, we began saying things that we just did not mean to each other, and we began to hurt each other really badly. And I remember a time where I thought, how am I ever going to forgive him for what he did? How could he ever say that to me? And it's really true what they say, that sometimes those who are closest to you, those who you love the most, can end up hurting you the most. And that's what happened. And during these moments, I remember recalling a certain particular story in the Bible, and that was the story of Joseph. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. So the story of Joseph spans over a few chapters in Genesis. It's a pretty long story. It goes from chapter 37 to 50. So I'm just going to run kind of briefly through it and kind of get to the meat of the story. So we enter the story when Joseph is 17 years old, and he has a really big family. He has 10 brothers, and he is the youngest. He's considered the miracle child. So Jacob favored and loved him like a ridiculous amount, more so than any of his other brothers. So he gave him a tunic, and it's a really beautiful tunic, magnificent. And in those days, if you were to wear a tunic like that, it symbolized that you had a lot of privilege, that you would be acknowledged appropriately. And as you can imagine, that did not make his brothers very happy. They were very envious. And to make matters worse, Joseph decides, I'm going to tell my brothers about my dreams. And so we can see that Joseph does not possess very much tact, but he is a very honest person. So out of being honest, he tells his brother that one day they are going to all bow down before him. And they get even more angry, and they hate him even more, to the point where they want to kill him. So one day as he's approaching them in the field, they decide to plot and scheme how to kill him. In the end, they decide to strip him of his tunic and throw him into a pit. And I can imagine Joseph being in that pit. It's probably a really deep and wide one. And he's probably thinking, okay, this has happened a few times. You know, my brothers pick on me a lot. There's 10 of them. Siblings, you know how they get. And they probably, you know, have pulled a prank or two on him. So he's probably saying to them, okay, guys, like, seriously, like, get me out of here. Like, this isn't funny anymore. And then he overhears them talking. And they're discussing something with people that he doesn't quite recognize, and they're Ishmaelites. And he hears them making a deal with these Ishmaelites. And he's probably thinking, because he's in this deep pit and he can't hear them very well, that they're probably making a deal to sell some sheep or goats. And he has no idea what's coming. And suddenly his brothers reach down and pull him out of the pit, and he's thinking, this is finally over, I get to go home. And then he realizes that he was the one that they were going to sell over to as a slave. And as he's passing by all of his brothers and looking at them and begging them and saying, you know, don't do this to me, come on, like, please don't do this to me. He realizes that he's being handed over as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. And I can just imagine the amount of betrayal that he feels, the amount of disappointment, confusion. And I think sometimes in our lives we have experienced that at least a time or two, where we we feel this sense of betrayal, and we think, how can someone who I love, who I trust so much, do something like that to me? I thought they loved me. I thought I could trust them. And we probably felt the same things that Joseph was feeling as he was being carried away on a camel, away from everything that he loved, sold like a piece of merchandise. And over the next 20 years, we read on and see that there are a lot of ups and downs in his life. There are moments of great favor, and then there's moments of great disappointment and undeserved suffering, as we have probably experienced in our lives. We have a lot of ups and downs. There are times where we have great success, we have happiness, we have joy, we have peace, like the first year of my marriage. And then things take a turn, and we experience a lot of disappointment and suffering. Some of them we deserve, and some of them we don't deserve. But one thing was very clear in the story of Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord is with us in the midst of our troubles, in the midst of our goods and our bad. But there was a very distinct difference about Joseph's life. You see, Joseph was in the Lord. And so when these situations and the circumstances that he faced in his life came about, he did not have an attitude of defeat. Rather, he praised God, and he kept his focus on him. And so God brought him to a place of great success, and he became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt during one of the greatest famines. And this is where we get the climax and the meat of the story. There had been a horrible famine, and the only place that had food left was Egypt because of Joseph. And who happens to be among those who traveled to Egypt to Pharaoh's palace? Well, his brothers. And this is the second time that they have journeyed, which is where we're going to dig into. It is going to be in Genesis 45. And once again, we find them all before Joseph. And Joseph, filled with emotions, he can't contain himself any longer. And in this pinnacle moment, I want us to imagine the amount of emotions that have been building up and that are rising up in the room. So we are going to read Genesis 45, 2 through 5. And he, Joseph, wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. Joseph then said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph says to them, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, and we can only imagine the expressions that his brothers are dealing with. They're probably dealing with a lot of shock. They're in disbelief. They thought their brother was dead. And they're probably very humiliated because they had been carrying, for what had been over 2 decades, a secret and immense guilt. And now they come face to face, and they're met to deal with this. And as we can see, they were in disbelief. They were so shocked, they had no words, and they could not answer him. This was not a tone of a happy reunion for them. Why? Well, one might sense that there was a sense of judgment that might be brought upon them for what they did many years ago. And 2, they are deeply humiliated. I mean, up to this point, they had bowed down to Joseph several times, and they're probably remembering that story that Joseph told them when they were a lot younger. However, Joseph's greatest desire is not vengeance. He has every reason to make them into his slaves as they made him a slave. But what does he desire? His deepest desire is reconciliation and relationship with the people who sinned against him. His ultimate desire is forgiveness. There are 2 aspects of forgiveness. The first aspect that that comes to our mind first is the person who did something wrong and now has ruined the relationship. The relationship is now destroyed, and they're seeking restoration, and they're seeking to build that relationship back up. And so they seek forgiveness. Then there's a second aspect of forgiveness, and this is the one that we have a little bit more trouble comprehending. And this is about the person who has been wronged against. Our immediate reaction to this, when this happens, is that they deserve vengeance. There must be revenge. What do we like in stories? What do we like to watch in movies? We like it when the good guys at the end come and bring vengeance on the bad guys, and that's a good ending, right? But life is not that simple and not that tidy. And unfortunately, just because someone gets revenge, it does not mean that they will get rid of anger and hatred. In fact, it often drives the person who is seeking revenge to inflict pain and hurt upon others who had nothing to do with the hurt to begin with. The only thing that can cleanse the heart and provide freedom from the burdens of anger and hatred is forgiveness. At the end of Joseph's account, it would be very understandable for us to find that the brothers got what they deserved. They became his slaves, and he became their master. And we would consider that a pretty good ending. But we get an even better ending. Instead, Joseph fell upon his brothers. He kissed them, and he wept over them. Joseph does not ignore the sin that was committed against him. Sin is sin. But he says, I'm not angry with you, because God has a plan for my life. Joseph shows us that even though people may hurt us and may do things against us in our life, God can turn around and use it for his glory. And then we see that Joseph not only says that he forgives them, he shows it in his actions. Later on in the same chapter, Joseph repays each of his brothers' evil deeds with acts of goodness. While his brothers drove him away, he said, come near to me. While his brothers tore his tunic off of him, he gave his brothers new garments. While his brothers sold him for 20 shekels of silver, he gave them 300 pieces of silver. And they took him away on a camel long ago, but he gives them fine Egyptian carts to bring back their families to him. And while they were going to leave him in a pit starving to death, he gives them food and all the provisions that they would need. He returns blessings for curses, and he repays evil with good. Joseph makes this look so easy. In actuality, true forgiveness is very difficult. And I say this because I have a personal experience of having to extend this kind of forgiveness in my life. When I was 16 years old, I was raped. And it was by my boyfriend in high school at the time, and he felt that he had to prove something to his friends. And I was left devastated, betrayed, really confused, and absolutely violated. There could not be anything worse that someone could do to you than to take that from you. And I dealt with a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness in my life for a very long time. He moved away eventually to another school, and I did not want to talk to him, so we never spoke again. And over the years, I carried this heavy burden of anger, and God had to work that out in me, but he knew I needed time. And it wasn't until 5 years later that God opened up an opportunity for me to come face to face with the person who had sinned against me. And I was able to meet up with him and tell him to his face that I had forgiven him. And as you can imagine, that was a release of freedom that I cannot even begin to express. And so we see here that forgiveness is not always easy, it's not always immediate, but with God, it is only with God, it is made possible. At the heart of the story and the story of God is this ultimate message. It is a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. I don't know if this message is for you today or not. Maybe some of you here have been deeply wounded or hurt. I want to encourage you with this. Trust me, I've been there. I know how hard it is. But God can take the bad, yes, even the sin that people commit against us, and turn it into something that glorifies him. But he requires us to go even further. He requires for us to extend forgiveness. He wants us to experience this freedom that only forgiveness can bring into your life. Just like Joseph, it is only made possible with God. And in my past situation, it was only made possible because I had God. So I pray that we will continually choose to glorify God in our painful situations, and that today we would choose forgiveness. Thank you.